Hello everyone, welcome to a new episode of GeoSpace. I'm your host Mohammed Salih, and I'm glad you are with us for another edition of the New Regions bi-weekly podcast, where we unpack the fast-changing dynamics of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Today, we are turning our attention to Iraq at a pivotal moment, from the US troops' withdrawal to the future of the Kurdistan region's energy sector, the disputes between Erbil and Baghdad, and much more. The United States has begun pulling its forces out of areas under federal government's control, including Ain al-Assad Air Base in Anbar province and sites in Baghdad, with some troops reportedly relocating to Erbil and Syria. Meanwhile, tensions between the Kurdistan Regional Government, or the KRG, and the federal government in Baghdad continue over energy and finances, even as Washington has shown a renewed interest both in supporting the KRG's energy capacity and in pressing for a resolution to the Baghdad KRG disputes. To discuss all this, I'm joined by Myles Caggins III, a retired U.S. Army colonel with a remarkable career and a senior non-resident fellow at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, where he provides expertise on public information warfare, Iraq, Syria, U.S. Kurdish relations, the Islamic State or ISIS, and military culture. His breadth and depth of expertise and career span nearly all of the subjects that we are covering today and more. Myles also served as senior spokesperson for the global coalition to defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and by virtue of that, he is a familiar face to many Kurds and Iraqis. He completed 3 combat tours in the region. He is also a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and now leads Words Warriors LLC, a translation public relations and business advisory firm with offices in New York City and Erbil. Before we dive in, just a reminder that you can find GeoSpace on the New Regions website under the Watch section, as well as on YouTube and SoundCloud channels. And don't forget to check our extensive coverage of Iraq and U.S.-Iraq relations on the New Regions website, including articles by Truly Yours on these subjects. Myles, welcome to GeoSpace. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's my pleasure to be here with you today, Kak Mohammed, and good to be talking to all the listeners of the New Region.
Thank you. Same here. Let me start with the question that's on many people's minds right now. The U.S. troops withdrawal from bases in Iraq outside the Kurdistan region has already started. This is in line with the U.S.-Iraq agreement last year that U.S. troops should relocate to Kurdistan by the end of this month, September 2025, that is, and then fully withdraw from all over Iraq, including the Kurdistan region, by the end of September 2026, next year. Is the current withdrawal that we are witnessing at the moment going to be partial or full, including what is going to happen next year as well?
It's a great question, and we're in a time of transition with the physical presence of U.S. troops in Iraq. But let's go back a little bit and set everything in context for some of your listeners. I know you have some very young listeners who are quite clever, teenagers, high school students, and college students who may not remember that in 2003, America had a coalition had a big invasion to topple the regime of Saddam Hussein. I was there during this time with the 4th Infantry Division in the Diyala province in cities like Bakuba, Muqtadiya, Mansuria, Jalula, Kanakin, Balat Ruz, Karatapa, and more. And during this time, there were probably about 170,000 Americans and some soldiers from other foreign nations all across Iraq from top to bottom and east to west. Then an agreement was signed during the administration of President George W. Bush that declared that U.S. troops would move out of cities and eventually depart Iraq, and that happened in 2012 under the Obama administration. Of course, we all know a few years later, ISIS swept through Syria and took over Mosul, and this caused great alarm to not only people in Iraq, but also the international community, as there were journalists beheaded in Syria, the siege and massacre and genocide against Yazidis in Sinjar. And as the ISIS continued to gain momentum and make progress toward the south and east and moving toward Baghdad, the government of Iraq invited U.S. forces to help provide advice, assistance, airstrikes, and operations on the ground to defeat ISIS. During the whole period, the White House and the American government has called this an advisory mission with a limited number of troops. At the most, there were probably around 8,000 troops at any time in Iraq, and now we're down to about 3,000, and this is where we are today.
Does since we are focusing and a lot of people are talking about this subject, does the US really want, and I think this is an important question a lot of people have on their minds, does the US really want to leave Iraq permanently, especially amid, a fateful regional conflict that has been going on for 2 years and is likely to continue for some time in the future? Does the US really want to leave the region, leave Iraq in particular, given that we're talking about Iraq, amid all this?
I would say the US is in Iraq at the invitation of the government of Iraq. And that's the most important feature of this relationship. Baghdad continues to welcome and rely on the additional stability and relationships from American and other Western and foreign forces. We saw this week that the new commander of U.S. Central Command, it's responsible for military operations throughout the Middle East and Central and South Asia. Central Command commander met with Prime Minister Soudani in Baghdad, and Prime Minister Soudani issued a public statement where he praised and appreciated the presence of U.S. troops and is looking for a continued bilateral relationship. The U.S. provides more than $1 billion a year in assistance to the Iraqi security forces, and Iraq is strategically in a place where the U.S. can have a presence to monitor operations and activities from Iran. And even more importantly, now that Syria is establishing a relationship with the United States that will include security and economic ties, the presence of American forces in very limited numbers in Iraq is a helpful connecting piece between all the regional partners, including Kuwait, Jordan, and Syria.
Right. We know that Iraq has, quite heavily relied on the U.S. over the past decade or so, encountering, the Islamic State, ISIS group, and, jihadi terrorism in the country. How do you think U.S. troops' movements and withdrawal, even if partial, at least, for the time being until next September, is going to affect Iraqi security forces' ability to independently, counter ISIS and other threats on their own?
The success of the Iraqi security forces with the assistance and backing of the global coalition has led to the defeat of ISIS. Now, there are still ISIS remnants in places like Rutba and Anbar province, in places near the Hamreen Mountains, Makmur Mountains, Tuz Kermatu. Some of these places still have ISIS remnants. But it is the responsibility of the Iraqi security forces and the Peshmerga to continue to apply pressure. In the past month, there have been airstrikes, successful airstrikes from the Iraqi Air Force against ISIS. There have been raids by the counterterrorism group from Kurdistan region against ISIS that have been successful. And because of the overall success, this provided an opportunity for the U.S. to move out of the Anbar province and slightly reduce the amount of American troops in and around Baghdad. But there are critical relationships that remain. The U.S. Special Operations continues to partner with the Iraqi Counterterrorism Service, and any American soldier will tell you that the Iraqi Counterterrorism Service is an elite fighting force. They are as strong and capable and proficient as U.S. Army Rangers, and America recognizes the importance of this relationship, as well as Iraq's central government and Ministry of Defense.
Miles, this is a very high stakes situation, of course, that we are talking about. We saw in 2011 when the United States under President Obama withdrew, all of U.S. troops from Iraq. What happened? There were like a sequence of events that ultimately led to the emergence of the, ISIS group. Some at the moment also argue that a complete withdrawal could basically lead to a repeat scenario of what happened in 2011 in some way, shape, or form. How real is that risk in today's Iraq and the region?
The responsibility of preventing an insurgency like ISIS is squarely on the shoulders of Iraq's federal government. There are still some conditions that could lead to the rise of insurgent groups, of terrorist groups. If we go and look at Mosul, Mosul is an area that continues to suffer economically from the damage and destruction of ISIS. There's a large population in Mosul who feels that the central government has not provided enough funding to rebuild Mosul. They're wondering, where is the money going? At the same time, there are various Hashid al-Shabi groups that have camped out in and around Mosul and Tikrit and Samara, and places where there were not previously these type of groups, these Shia-backed militia groups. So this causes some fractures and fault lines and tensions in society. It will be important that the central government works to have a Iraqi government that serves all people, whether they're from Basra, Nasiriyah, Wasit, Babel, Tikrit, Choman, Sulaymaniyah. The central government needs to be serving all people and focus on projects and policies that help Iraqi people continue to grow economically and help young people have opportunities.
I think a lot of people, would agree with that. But do you also think that given what we are actually witnessing on the ground in the country, and, given that you're someone who also kind of frequently still visits the country, do you think those kind of conditions and that kind of attitude is actually in place as far as the, federal government's policies and way of dealing with the population, especially in the Sunni Arab majority areas, is concerned?
The central government has challenges, and most of the challenges in Iraq are political in nature. Let's go a little bit higher than Iraq and look at the neighboring countries. Kuwait is a country with oil in their economy. Saudi has oil in their economy. Qatar. These nations have made decisions to focus investments on infrastructure and roads and schools, electricity, and this benefits all of the people. Iraq is the number 2 oil producer from OPEC, and there's a plenty of money made in the oil and gas sector. And the leaders will have to do their best to provide services to people from top to bottom, left to right of Iraq, and that will help with the security situation. We have seen uprisings and protests in Basra, in Amara, in Nasiriyah. So this is not just a Sunni Shia, Kurd, Sunni Shia, Erbil, Baghdad issue. This is all of the people of Iraq are desperate. They're yearning to have the same type of opportunities that they see people in neighboring countries having.
Right. Do you see any scenario amid all of this? I'm sure you are very well aware, that a lot of Kurds would like to see, a long-term U.S. military presence in the Kurdistan region. And by a lot of Kurds, I mean both at the, political level, among the officials, and also at the popular level. Do you see any scenario where U.S. troops might actually establish a long-term presence in the Kurdistan region beyond 2026, even if, things got to a point where, they would have to withdraw from other parts of Iraq due to the insistence of the, Iraqi government, for example?
I anticipate that U.S. troops will have a multi-year presence in Kurdistan region. There is strong backing from members of the American Congress to continue to fund the presence of U.S. troops in Kurdistan region. The troops in Kurdistan region are tied to, they are connected to the U.S. troops in northeastern Syria. And America has had a very successful relationship and partnership with the Peshmerga as well as anti-terror forces. It's notable that since 2003, there has not been American troops killed in Kurdistan region. And the main attacks against American troops in Kurdistan region have come from Iran and its ballistic missiles or its deadly drones.
Uh, from your vantage point, given that this is a very multifaceted issue and situation, what is ultimately going to drive this timeline of the U.S. Troops' presence in Iraq? Is it U.S. domestic politics? Is it Iraqi pressure? Is it a combination of these and other factors? What are the, factors that are going to determine how, for how long, in what way the U.S., will maintain its troops in Iraq?
American domestic politics are important for the decisions about keeping U.S. troops in Iraq. But I would say it's very clear that in the Kurdistan region, Prime Minister Barzani has continued to welcome and talk about the importance of U.S. troops, as well as President Nechervan Barzani and political leaders from PUK and KDP. The populace of Kurdistan region, the people, all of my experiences there are that people really welcome and appreciate American troops and American culture throughout Kurdistan region. I've met with families and people in Zako, and they talk passionately and fervently about their experiences partnering with U.S. troops in years past in the wars. If you go over to Suli, there's a strong partnership between commando units there and U.S. Special Operations advisors, and a general sentiment that is quite welcoming to American military and also American people and American investors. In the United States, there has been a rush from both political parties to end the wars, get the troops home. I think this is an opportunity in American politics to reframe the idea of troops being deployed and the purpose of them. We have had more than 25,000 soldiers in Korea on the Korean Peninsula. That's been for many decades. We have had now around 35,000 troops in Europe. And these are places where there never seems to be a call for the troops to come home, but for the getting bang for the buck for the economic benefit, the cost benefit analysis, having soldiers in Kurdistan region in northeastern Syria provides way more value to the United States than having thousands of troops in Europe and South Korea and other places around the world where they're not questioned. So I think we will see more vocal members of Congress and the United States Senate encouraging the White House to continue to have troops present in Iraq and particularly in the Kurdistan region of Iraq.
You mentioned that Prime Minister Mohammed Shia Sudani's reaction was positive to the U.S. troops, presence in Iraq during his recent meeting with the commander of CENTCOM. If you recall last year when that agreement was signed between Iraq and U.S., on a timeline for U.S., troops withdrawal, it was under very different regional and domestic circumstances. The Iran-led access, of which some of the Iraqi Shia groups are, components and members, officially or unofficially, was not really, in the situation, in the weakened situation where it is today. The Assad regime had not fallen yet. In Lebanon, Hezbollah was still, a very powerful political, slash militia group. Hamas was somehow putting up a fight in Gaza still, and at that particular point, the Iran-led access and the Iraqi Shia groups that are part of that access felt quite confident, and they wanted the U.S. troops out because they believed that the U.S. is aiding Israel in the war in Gaza. But now, a year after that, it's a completely different situation. Hezbollah has been, decimated at the top. Assad regime has fallen. Iran has been bombed on a number of occasions by Israel, including during the 12-day war recently in June. It's, weakened really in a way that no one could imagine a year ago. And there is, this sense of panic in Baghdad, especially among Shia political elites and groups, that, they are now in a weak point position, and that having the U.S. troops surrounding Iraq is actually somehow a guarantee that Iraq would not be dragged into the regional conflict that is still going on in one way or another. Do you think, that's actually something that Iraq now wants? They want a continued U.S. Troops, deployment in Iraq, including in areas under the control of the federal government, even if they're not coming out to publicly make statements, to that effect?
There's a trade-off that Iraq gets from having physical presence of U.S. troops. As I mentioned earlier, $1 billion of military assistance, foreign military sales, equipment. This is all helpful for the Iraqi security forces. The U.S. troops are definitely not inside of Iraq to attack anybody in Iraq. There are times where Hashid al-Shabi has attacked U.S. bases and even killed U.S. and British troops while I was in Iraq in 2020. And America's response to that was quite measured. There has been political and diplomatic discussions related to the PMF law. And certainly the United States has concern about organizations like Brigade 45, Kataib Hezbollah, that take direct marching orders from Tehran. America is concerned that these groups would receive funding from Iraq's central government. But despite whatever else is happening in the region, the American troops inside of Iraq are not focused on attacking Iran or having any wars inside of Iraq. This relationship is transitioning to bilateral relationship that will include additional training, advising, and implementation of equipment sales to the Iraqi security forces.
Recently, we had the, Congressman Joe Wilson introduce an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act that designates the KRG as a vital strategic partner of the United States. The earlier version of the NDAA that was introduced, the bill, did not seem to really show much interest or from the Kurdish perspective, appreciation for the U.S. Kurdish Peshmerga military partnership that has, at least a couple of decades of history to it. Are we seeing, how we should really interpret this? First, either a decline in, in that, let's say, appreciation for that relationship on the Hill in the U.S. in the Congress, or not? Like, how do you see this relationship and how it is being perceived and understood and appreciated in the U.S.?
Congressman Joe Wilson is one of our louder members of Congress. He's a Republican from South Carolina. He's a strong supporter of President Trump. And his outspokenness is also matched by actual policy alignment with Republicans and Democrats who form what's called the Kurdish caucus. So we have more than 30 members of the US Congress who have a great interest in Kurdistan for security, economic, and cultural ties. And they are Republicans and Democrats. I'd like to note that the KRG's office in Washington, D.C., led by Ms. Trifa Aziz, is actively and continually working with members of Congress, State Department, and the U.S. Department of Treasury and Commerce, and even the White House. They are working to continue to keep Kurdistan region at the forefront of American policy. And prior to Trifa Aziz, Ms. Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman, she was an excellent leader of that office. And this includes social events. In Washington, D.C., there's a Nowruz event that happens every year where the KRG office will invite influential members of the U.S. government to come and celebrate Kurdish culture. But it also involves hard-hitting diplomacy, where the representation of Kurdistan region is going door to door in the U.S. Congress and Senate and advocating for continued funding and support of the Peshmerga, as well as favorable trade and economic policies, including the opening of the Iraq-Turkey pipeline for oil. These are all things that the Kurdistan region government is pushing. And this is necessary because Americans do not understand the distinction between Baghdad and Kurdistan region. Our education system, it's quite nuanced. We see Iraq as a full country, and our policymakers are not quite understanding the difference, both physically, culturally, and the structure of the Iraqi constitution from 2005 that created the Kurdistan region.
Do you think this partnership between, the Kurdistan region and the U.S. that has been, going on in various sectors over the past several decades, do you think, there's still that sort of level of understanding and appreciation for this relationship to continue into the future, even if the U.S. decides to reduce its engagement in the Middle East and in particular in Iraq?
I think the relationship will continue to grow. And this relationship goes back to the 90s. I know people who were airlifted here in the 90s, and they've settled in places like Nashville, Tennessee, and Dallas, Texas. My good friend, Ambassador Peter Galbraith, was there in the late 80s and 90s meeting with the initial leaders of the Kurdistan region from the strong families. And I know that this relationship will continue. Another aspect that is important is the reporting that is happening at the New Region or in publications like the Kurdistan Chronicle to continue to provide information in English language to American stakeholders. So the relationship will continue to grow, and that knowledge and education about Kurdish people and Kurdistan region will be at the top of mind for American decision makers in business and government and security.
Myles, let's move to another important aspect, of the relationship between the federal government in Baghdad and the Kurdistan Regional Government, or the KRG, and that is the energy question. And I know that you wear different hats, like myself, kind of. And you are, you have been involved with the energy sector in Kurdistan, and you also serve as a spokesperson for the Association of the Petroleum Industry of Kurdistan, or APIKUR. So, in May this year, there was a couple of, large contracts or deals signed between the KRG and two US-based companies, HKN Energy and Western Zagros, to develop gas fields in the Kurdistan region. And the deals were estimated to be to the tunes of, over $100 billion. We saw that Baghdad, did not like those deals. It immediately reacted with statements that opposed the deal, and then it went on to, basically block KRG's budget transfers from Baghdad to the KRG. How important do you think, these contracts, these new deals are for the KRG's economic future and also for Iraq in a way, given that Iraq, has a major deficiency in terms of, gas production and the fact that it relies so heavily on the gas, natural gas that it imports from Iran?
One of my company's clients is the Association of the Petroleum Industry of Kurdistan. And the association is composed of 8 international oil companies, including HKN and Western Zagros, as you mentioned. And we found it quite interesting to see some politicians in Baghdad and some of the Iraqi parliamentarians from the south bristle, push back, and even a few of them made a lawsuit after the term sheets were signed for developing the natural gas in Kurdistan region. Iraq does not have enough electricity, but Iraq has plenty of natural gas, and Iraq must convert natural gas to electricity. It makes no sense for Iraq to import gas and electricity from Iran and electricity from Turkey when it can create its own. Let's be real here, people. Electricity has been part of human lives for more than 100 years. If you're on an airplane and you're flying over countries like Kuwait or Germany or Brazil, you'll see electricity all the time. Iraq is unique in that it is a very wealthy country that has not solved, it's not solving a problem, it has not implemented 24-hour electricity everywhere. But we see in Kurdistan region that the Renaki program has created 24-hour electricity for a lot of people, and the reduction of diesel generators. There's less smoke and pollution the last time I was in Erbil a few weeks ago. And all of Iraq should be this way, but Iraq must realize, remove the politics and create more opportunities for foreign investors to come and build up the energy sector. This is happening. We've seen Prime Minister Soudani sign recent deals with Honeywell and some other big American companies that are going to come in and continue to develop natural gas and electricity in federal Iraq. But it needs to be a full effort all the time, and no politicians should try to stop this from happening in Kurdistan region.
If you recall, when those gas deals were signed in May during a trip by KRG's Prime Minister Massoud Barzani, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the Energy Secretary, and other, senior officials in the Trump administration really lauded those contracts, and it was being framed as a basically something that is going to help the entire Iraq. And all of that was also seen as unprecedented in terms of the level of support that the U.S. extended to the KRG's energy sector and its development, and the involvement of U.S. firms. How much leverage do you think? Well, I mean, first, let me ask this: are we actually witnessing a qualitative change at this point in terms of how the U.S. government, how the U.S. Administration is approaching and looking at Kurdistan region's energy sector in a way, that sets it apart from how previous administrations have looked at Kurdistan's energy sector, especially, given if you remember back in the 2000s, the US government even opposed the establishment of oil refineries in Kurdistan, let alone developing, an energy sector.
Under the Trump administration, we're in what's called America's golden era. And America's golden era is about the nation developing as much economic growth as it can. And this includes its international energy development. And if there's been a shift from the prior administration, it is that the government, the U.S. government, including the State Department and Department of Treasury, will actively engage foreign governments to create opportunities for American companies. This is where you see the strong statements, public statements, vocal statements from high-level American officials, including the Secretary of State, as you mentioned, Marco Rubio. And if you peek over and look into Syria, you can already see that American companies that are beginning to work there have the backing of Washington, D.C. I wouldn't necessarily say there's a distinction between Kurdistan region and federal Iraq, because there are American companies that have been operating successfully in federal Iraq. There is more growth from them, including one of the APICUR members that has signed an agreement to work with North Oil Company near Kirkuk. But what we see now is that America is more willing to weigh in and have a voice when there are disputes between Baghdad and Erbil that impact the economic growth of Iraq. The Washington, D.C. sees this as common sense. If Iraq needs more money, and Iraq is an economy that's based on oil and gas, then Iraq should do everything possible to improve its oil and gas economy. The Minister of Oil in Baghdad has said that Iraq wants to go from 4 million barrels of oil a day exported to 6 million barrels of oil a day exported in a few years. Well, in order for Iraq to achieve that goal, there must be oil that is developed and exported from Kurdistan region, and American companies are there to help the whole economy grow.
We in July there was like a wave of attacks by armed factions, militias in other parts of Iraq on energy installments and energy fields in the Kurdistan region, and that prompted Secretary Rubio to pick up the phone and speak to Prime Minister Soudani about it, and the U.S. In very strong terms condemned those attacks. And the U.S. Also, as I said, seems to have a growing interest in developing Kurdistan region's energy sector. Do you think, given all of this, like how much leverage does Washington really have when it comes to protecting U.S. energy interests in Kurdistan and ensuring that, that the energy sector in Kurdistan region keeps growing, keeps developing, and that, Baghdad would not be an impediment to that?
Washington has a strong interest in the stability of all of Iraq. And the attacks over the summer on the oil production fields that were from British companies and Norwegian, as well as American companies, were a sign that these outlaw Hashid al-Shabi groups must be controlled. They must be stopped by Baghdad. Prime Minister Soudani said he is responsible for stopping these groups from making attacks on commercial infrastructure. The U.S. also has an interest in this, but again, as I mentioned earlier, America is not seeking to begin wars inside of Iraq. So the expectation is that the federal government, as well as supported by the Kurdistan regional government, will provide safety for the civilian personnel who are working at these oil fields. Now, more than 81% of the employees at the international oil companies in Iraq's Kurdistan region are Iraqi citizens, mostly Kurds, but they're all Iraqi citizens. So these attacks on the oil fields are attacks on Iraqis. Therefore, Baghdad and Erbil must work together to control this. This is of great interest, though, in Washington, D.C., and there have been conversations among senior officials at the White House and State Department and Pentagon to look for solutions to protect critical petroleum and economic infrastructure and also protect the people that work in these places. So I think in the next months and years ahead, you might see more requests for air defense and counter drone technologies, and those will be arrangements made between the government of the United States and Kurdistan region in Baghdad.
Do you think, given that that has been a request from the KRG for the past several years, do you think there's actually more of a chance, actual chance, that those, more advanced types of weaponry would be provided to the KRG?
Well, these are defensive systems, and I think there's an opportunity now that we have seen these types of devastating attacks that there would be more political agreement from all sides to have systems to protect this important economic infrastructure.
During, those drone attacks back in July, the oil production levels in the Kurdistan region, took a severe hit. They plummeted to under 100,000 barrels per day. But there has been a gradual recovery ever since. Can you tell us, like, what is the production level at the moment across all fields in the Kurdistan region?
Well, I point you to the KRG Ministry of Natural Resources for production level numbers. But the companies that I work with are absolutely focused on security and safety for their employees and also protection of their equipment. And they are in the business of producing oil to make a profit. So as they are able to bring their production back online, they are reporting this information publicly for the particularly for the publicly traded companies.
So, I'm sure you are very well aware of the KRG Baghdad oil and energy disputes, and these disputes have dragged on for nearly 2 decades, really, by now. And we've just heard reports of a new agreement that was reported by the new region today. The details aren't clear yet, but hearing the word an agreement between Baghdad and the KRG isn't as exciting anymore. We have had multiple agreements, numerous ones probably over the past years or decade or 2 decades. And we are still at the point where, these problems persist, these disputes persist. Uh, like, what keeps blocking a durable, functioning agreement? What is impeding that?
On the agreements, I will say this: it's positive, even though these announcements are often premature and not necessarily coming from sources in the room. But it is an indication that all sides are talking, and that's important because a year ago nobody was talking to each other. So now people are talking. Civil servants in Kurdistan region have been paid for 2 months now, but these agreements need to be made permanent by putting them in writing. For your listeners, I understand that most people who listen to the new region are familiar with the dynamics of Iraqi politics and this constitutional relationship between Kurdistan region and the federal government. But in the broader oil and gas industry, these agreements are new and they're complex. The contracts for oil production in Kurdistan region, those contracts are signed between international oil companies and the KRG. The oil is exported through a pipeline that goes through Turkey and the port of Ceyhan. The quantity of oil and the sale at the port is coordinated through federal Iraq's SOMO, State Oil Marketing Company. So you have a lot of different stakeholders with their own interest who must sign these agreements and cooperate to have oil exported. So these things take time, but certainly we know that there have been political groups, outside groups who have wanted to slow down the process. And the companies that I represent are always at the table and have behind the scenes been working very actively to conclude this issue of exports through the Iraq-Turkey pipeline.
What about the international oil companies, the IOCs? What do they want in this equation? And to what extent are their interests really helping or hindering the chances of a lasting agreement between Baghdad and the KRG on the issue of energy?
Almost 20 years ago, DNO, which is a Norwegian company, began making investments in Iraq's Kurdistan region to develop oil. And since that time, the oil and gas industry has built up a capability of exporting around 400,000 barrels of oil per day. And the companies are interested in having their investments be commercially viable. And in order to do that, they need to make sure that there are written agreements that make it very clear of the responsibilities between the oil companies, the KRG, and the central government in Baghdad. And they also want to have very clear understanding of the method and pathway for sales and payments for the oil that they produce. It's very simple. Everywhere in the world, every business, before there is any sort of transaction, there is some type of agreement, no different in the oil and gas industry. But the control, the central, most important group is the central government in Baghdad as well as the KRG. The companies have the least amount of weight to throw around in these important discussions.
So I assume, given that these contracts were signed with the KRG, KRG does not oppose the IOC's, demands and requirements. Why is it, that Baghdad has not really warmed up to, these IOC's contract terms with the KRG as they were in the past?
Well, the KRG is a contractual counterparty to the international oil companies, but that doesn't mean that they're always having the same view of things. If you remember, a couple of years ago, Kurdistan region and Ministry of Natural Resources controlled all of the exports through the Iraq-Turkey pipeline. So now they have had to make some concessions and modifications on that process because SOMO and the federal government is having a more centralized role. And there is a direct tie now, direct linkage between the payments of civil servant salaries and oil exports. So it's not as simple as IOCs plus KRG fighting Baghdad. There are all three parties have different requirements. I wouldn't necessarily use the word demands. I think that's a little more adversarial, but certainly requirements to ensure that they're adhering to laws and that they're operating in a way that is within their existing contracts and also produces the best outcomes economically for the parties involved.
Let me ask you about another issue very quickly that has been making headlines in Iraq, and that is the Popular Mobilization Forces law that we saw, the US oppose very strongly and that bill has now been removed from the agenda of the Iraqi parliament, reportedly. From your perspective, would passing this kind of low risk pushing US Iraq relations into deeper confrontation? And I'm asking this because it might come up in the future parliament after the November 2025 elections. Or do you think, there's still some space for compromise between the US and Iraq over this issue before, it becomes another problematic point in their relationship?
Well, in my work for the New Lines Institute, I'm always looking at security issues. And I have also personal experience having served in Baghdad and at Union 3 base. And I remember one time I was meeting my counterpart, Major General Tassin. He's a spokesman for Ministry of Defense now. And one time he was having a meeting with leaders from Hashid al-Shabi. And I was told, hey, you cannot be in this meeting. So the PMF has always been part of the unique relationships between American, international troops, Iraqi security forces, and Ministry of Defense. What America is interested in is a Iraq that is a secure and safe place without uh, militia forces that are taking instructions from foreign governments and putting America's people and its interest in harm's way. I think, though, there will always be a loud an active group of Iraqi parliamentarians who are pushing for more funding of the Hashid al-Shabi, and the U.S. will always push back against that, especially if America has information and intelligence that shows that indicates that these groups are taking instructions from Tehran and threatening American interest in the region.
Let me ask you the final question here. It might put you in some hot water, but some Kurdish and Iraqi leaders have, in the past couple of years, and these leaders include former Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi and former President Barham Salih, for example, who have called for confederalism as the proper framework for managing disputes between, KRG, Kurdistan region, and the federal government in Baghdad. Of course, with a view to the fact that this is a historical issue has been going on since the very beginning of the formation of the Iraqi state, when the Kurds didn't really want to be part of Iraq. So do you think confederalism is a realistic path forward given all that we have seen and continue to see that in a way hinders the continuation or the development of a functioning and healthy relationship otherwise between the two sides?
The best thing that can happen for Iraqis as it pertains to the structure of government established in the 2005 Constitution is to implement it in a way that provides equality, fairness, dignity, and respect for all. And I understand the power sharing between the presidency, the Speaker of Parliament, and the Prime Minister. But the focus and mindset of all the leaders needs to be what benefits all people of Iraq. When Prime Minister Sudani comes to the UN and addresses the UN General Assembly here in New York in a couple of weeks, he will speak about one Iraq. And that must be implemented not just in words, but also in deeds. And that will be the most important thing. I leave Iraqi politics up to the politicians of Iraq and the people of Iraq. But I think if everybody is respectful in implementing the Constitution the way it is written, then the country should be strong and growing and really look like the number two oil producer in the world with such a rich history as the cradle of civilization, the land of Mesopotamia. Iraq should be the top destination in the Middle East for travel and business.
I totally agree with you, Miles, that there is a lot of potential in terms of developing that relationship in a way that is beneficial for everyone, every community in the country, and that sticking to the Constitution, the 2005 Constitution, is definitely one of the good path moving forward. That wraps up our conversation today. Myles, it's been a real pleasure having you on the show and hearing your perspective. For our audiences, Myles Caggins III is a retired U.S. Army colonel, and he has served numerous roles as the spokesperson for the global coalition to defeat ISIS, and he's also a senior non-resident fellow with the New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. And to our listeners, thank you as always for tuning in. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of GeoSpace.